Hello, everyone. You're watching our Diversity, Inclusion, Equity and Inclusion series. I'm Neza Alawi, founder and CEO of Join Mayshad, the New York-based company that empowers women on a daily basis. I'm here today with Jan Mercer-Dam, our VP of Development, Jennifer Witter, and Jasmine Cooper. Hello, Jan.
Hi, Neza. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us here today for our Tuesday Diversity, Equity, Inclusion show. As Neza mentioned, we're a company for women by women, an ecosystem where we connect women to each other and to the companies, causes, and organizations that champion equity for women professionally and personally. Through our live event series, through our workshops, and through our brain trust sessions, we bring to our subscribed members opportunities to connect with deep, meaningful conversations, while at the same time generating really creative ways to do business together. We host Diversity, Equity, Inclusion series on Tuesdays at 4, followed by Workshop Wednesdays. We have a very special workshop planned for you this Wednesday. Please make sure to tune in and check out joinmayshad.com. We also host our Women in Money series on Thursdays at 4 p.m. as well, and we kick off each and every week with Dr. Risa Reiger, one of our investors and clinical psychologists who helps set up our week for success. Please make sure to include your comments in the comments bar, and we'll get to them in the Q&A session. And you can learn more about us at joinmayshad.com. Thanks, Neza, for hosting us.
Thank you. Impact of America's race problem is at the forefront of our minds and souls. Impact to all of us individually and collectively on how we think about our own personal identity and our roles as leaders in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today's episode is on how implicit bias play into race, sex, and much more. Hello, Jennifer. Hello, Jasmine. Our guest today, Jennifer Witter, is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of the Borland Group, Inc., a New York City boutique public relations firm with a focus on women-led and minority-owned businesses and nonprofits. It was selected by TheStreets.com as one of the 5 national Black-owned businesses making a buzz. Jennifer was named one of the nation's 10 successful Black CEOs and entrepreneurs. Her book, The Little Book of Big PR, 100 Quick Tips to Get a Small Business Notice, was published by HarperCollins. Jasmine is the Senior Manager of Diversity, Inclusion, and Corporate Social Responsibility at Steptoe & Johnson. Her expertise is workplace culture and the professional development of diverse employees. Through establishing these programs and initiatives, she's able to elevate the impact of an organization's brand awareness to key clients and decision makers in domestic and international locations. My first question today is to Jennifer and Jasmine. So let's first get super clear on unconscious bias. What is it for women? What does it mean? How does it come to be? And what are the outcomes of implicit bias? We can talk the sheer exhaustion to microaggressions, to perpetuation of institutionalized racism.
Okay. Well, the definition of implicit bias is pretty straightforward. Basically, what it is a prejudice of which we are unaware. With racism, that is a master status of someone. They know they are a racist. They are proud of it. When you tell a person or help them to see what bias they have, and I've spoken on this topic a lot, they are usually ashamed, they are horrified, and they want to change it. It has to go. With a racist, it is like a badge of honor for the person. Think about it. With the Proud Boys in Charlottesville, that's the best example I can give to you in recent times, where they went marching through that Virginia city and they didn't even cover their faces. They went out there and they were saying despicable things about people of color, as well as people of different religions, and they were proud of it. So the main difference between a racist is that they go forth, they spout their despicable sayings, they are proud of it, whereas with someone who has an implicit bias is truly unaware of it. And with implicit bias, it is very insidious because we all have it, but we don't know that we have it. And it goes beyond so many things, race and gender. But for women in particular, with bias directed against us, it is so many layers that can have an impact on ways that we never even thought in terms of economy. And I'll give you a quick example. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, for women, if we go 1% over our accepted body weight, it results in 6% less in family income. Now think about that. Simply because you're a little overweight, and in the United States, we are gaining weight, and I think the average size of an American woman is 14 or 16. Forget her educational level, forget what she brings to the table, forget her value. But because she's a little bit overweight, that can correspond in her bringing home less money. And it trickles throughout the entire family. What can they buy? What kind of education will they have? Where will they live? So that is an example that most people are unaware of when they think of implicit bias.
Thank you, Jennifer, for putting light on the difference. And I've never seen it like this, as it's true. You know, the implicit bias, it's you're half conscious of it, you're a little bit shy about it, but you do have it on you, and it does affect a lot. And then the racist is someone who will viciously on the opposite, you know, like try to brag about it. Jasmine, what do you have to add there?
So building on that point, when we really think about what's more dangerous, racism or unconscious bias, it can get a little bit tricky. When we think about what happened in Charlottesville with, unfortunately, ended with loss of life, loss of property, et cetera, we can easily identify that that was racist, it was wrong. You know, we're all on the same page about that. Unconscious bias is where it gets a little bit more tricky, because unconscious bias is really based on your environment, how you were raised, your friends, who you socialize with, where you work, where you choose to eat, where you choose to spend your money. Your unconscious bias is based on the internal narrative that runs in your head whenever you encounter someone or a situation that's different than you. Part of it just comes from, you know, how we are wired as humans, right? We tend to group ourselves with people that are like us. We tend to be suspicious of those who aren't like us. It's a defense mechanism. It's natural. But what happens is from that place of reaction, unconscious bias informs how we react to those that are unlike us. And oftentimes it always relies on stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. Is it the first time in history that we are clearly differentiating both?
I don't think it's the first time in history. I think that we are starting to have language for a lot of we're starting to be able to apply discourse to a lot of sentiments that have always existed, right? So unconscious bias, implicit bias, proximity bias, all these different words are relatively new, but they're simply quantifying what we've always felt, what we've always knew to exist. And I think that is what we're seeing now is where we didn't necessarily see 4 years ago, 8 years ago, and throughout history is there's a very clear demarcation between what's really more pervasive in society. Yes, we can easily call out the racist. Yes, we can easily lump them into one corner, but the unconscious bias is what's really working to break down different parts of our society and disproportionately affects diverse folks, including women.
Just to add on to Jasmine's points, and I agree with everything that you say, is that unconscious bias, again, also known as implicit bias, starts at a really young age, between 3 and 5. And it's usually centered around race and gender. And as we get older, it adds on to the other things, weight, skin tone, sexuality. And just to underscore what Jasmine said, it is baked into our DNA to be influenced by our family, where we live, where we grew up, with our religion. Now, with implicit bias, it's always been there. But it's never been talked about. It was never seen as something as important. And I can speak from my own personal experience when I have spoken to other people who are white, and I have told them, I have been followed in stores. I have been denied housing. I was almost thrown off a plane because of this. And they would say, oh, Jennifer, that's just that's just one thing that happened. It's just random. But especially with what is happening within these past 2 months, not just with George Floyd, but with Breonna Taylor, with the young man who was jogging, and we have cell phone video. Our words were never enough to move the needle, but you were able to see the video. And as I've said, it's like the scales have fallen from eyes, where implicit bias is not some out-of-worldly thing, but it's something that people of color have had to deal with day in, day out. And when we spoke about it, people did not take us, for the most part, seriously.
I think it's so interesting what you're both saying. And Jasmine, to your point around, we're the product of our socialization processes. And because of that, we also aren't always amongst other communities that don't look like us. And so therefore, we don't know what we don't know. Mm-hmm. Right. And I'm wondering, Jennifer, to your point as well, just in the sense of, how does this impact then how we identify for ourselves and how we identify and what do we do with that, both professionally and personally? And at Mayshad, we do talk a lot about the complexity and the intersectionality of identity, knowing that we, at the same time, as strong professional women, want to stay true to ourselves, who we are, what we believe in, what we value, our moral code of ethics. And then there's all these different other worlds in which we operate, and we live in many different worlds and wear many different hats. Jasmine, you had shared originally with me when we talked about doing the show a personal story as well. And thank you, Jennifer, for being so honest with your experiences, and we would love to hear more about that too. Jasmine, I'm wondering if you would like to share what's happened for you and your family recently as well, and why do you think this is so critical to be having these conversations at this particular moment in time?
I think it's now been 3 weeks. For those who may not be familiar, there was a viral video 3 weeks ago of an encounter between a white woman and a black man in Central Park, in the Ramble in Central Park. And it was this back and forth over putting the leash on the dog. The dog owner, the woman, Amy Cooper, refused to do so. And the black man, who is my uncle, Chris Cooper, pulled out his cell phone and started recording. And what we saw, those 30 seconds or 45 seconds, was a very clear-cut, blatant, easily digestible example of unconscious bias that took a racist turn. What happened was, in this specific area that they were in, it's required that dogs, are supposed to be on the leash. She did not want to leash her dog, and my uncle would not back down. And she threatened to call the police and tell them specifically that an African-American man was threatening her life and the life of her animal. And we saw, what happened next. He calls the 911 operator. She is increasingly hysterical, describing what's happening to her or what's not happening to her. We see the dog, the poor animal, and all this is literally being choked through all of this drama and through all of this hysterics. She puts the leash on the dog. My uncle said, "Thank you," stopped recording, and walked away. And he shared that video on Facebook, and then it went to Twitter, and then it went viral. I think what's most important from that video is a few points. Jennifer mentioned how unconscious bias is something that Black and brown people, women, anyone who's really not a white male have experienced forever. And I've seen some questions on social media as to, well, why did he pull out the camera and why did he record? Again, when we ask those questions, it tips the balance between responsibility, right? Why are we questioning why was this situation reported? The other part of that is in seeing this video and it being an excellent example and a teachable moment and a conversation point. Throughout history, Black and brown people or groups of people that are oppressed have oftentimes had to prove that they are oppressed. They've oftentimes had to be able to show that they're telling the truth. That again is institutionalized inequity. If I say it's something that we experience as women, if I say this happened to me, why do I have to have video to prove it? Why does it need to be corroborated by somebody else? The biggest takeaway in that video was before one, she intentionally told my uncle, I'm going to tell the police an African-American man is threatening me. He intentionally weaponized law enforcement as a means to control a situation that she no longer could control. Again, when I saw the video as women, I get it, right? Sometimes you're out, you're walking your dog, you have one eye on the dog, one eye on what's going on, one eye on your phone. My uncle was bird watching, so it's very possible that from her perspective, he did jump out of the bush. He did come from behind a tree. I don't doubt that maybe she was even initially startled. But when she recognized that a Black person, especially a Black man, was not willing to let her have her way, she made a decision to change the dynamic, and in doing so, quite frankly, could have ended my uncle's life. We've had that conversation, it's come up, well, how can you forgive her? She could have had your uncle killed and things like that. Do I, in my heart, think that she wished death on my uncle? No. But do we know that police interactions between Black and brown people can mean death? Yes. And we saw that. What happened with my uncle was between 7 and 8 a.m. Monday. George Floyd was dead by police hands by that afternoon. So we had two examples, not even within a full day, not even within a full news cycle, within literally a work day, of two extremes of what can happen when police are weaponized against Black and brown people. So my most biggest takeaway from that is, and I get asked this question a lot, do we think Amy Cooper is racist? No. However, we think she reacted in a racist way. And her reactions were based on her own bias and her own assumptions about Black people. More so, again, because we don't know Amy personally, the assumption is she has been conditioned and raised and encouraged to feel like if a Black person is out of control, call the police. And that is not the function of law enforcement. Law enforcement is here to protect and serve, and law enforcement are actually valuable members of our community. And they're here to work within our community. And when we weaponize law enforcement, again, we're changing the dynamics of the system that's supposed to run a certain way. So that's pretty much my thoughts and my sentiments about what happened around Amy.
Jasmine, thank you. Thank you for sharing that story. And I appreciate what you just said. And I think it's really impactful and bears repeating again, in the sense that, there's everyday acts of racism that people who are not racist can actually be engaged in. And I'm wondering, in this moment in time, and Jennifer, point well taken earlier too, around the uses of all the digital technologies that we have access to now, and how that's really heightened the information and how we share information 24/7 in ways where it may not have been available or accessible or just, possible in the past. I'm wondering, also given the fact that we have COVID-19 right now, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And so there's been seismic shifts just in the way in which the pandemic has looked. Like, we know that it affects everyone, right? Millions of people have contracted it. We have over 120,000 deaths here in the United States. We also know that while it's an equal opportunity virus, but it impacts people differently based upon their race as well. And that's the result of systemic institutionalized racism in this country, in the sense of everything from access to healthcare to pre-existing conditions and, you know, diabetes and heart disease, and et cetera, and how that impacts African American communities more. To Jasmine and Jennifer, do you think that in this moment in time that the reaction to what we're seeing now with the global protests in support of Black Lives Matter and bringing more racial justice to the United States, that the pandemic has served to play a role in that?
I don't know if it played a role in it. Things were tootling along without any change until Mr. Floyd was murdered. Let's face it, Blacks have not been treated fairly overall by the American healthcare system. With my own story, my very beloved mother was a nurse, and she had her primary care physician for many years. And she was experiencing pains in her chest. And she went to the doctor, and keep in mind, again, she was a medical professional, and she explained to him what the problem was. And he's a white man. And he looked at my mother and said, "Are you depressed?" My mother said, "Yes, I'm depressed because I have pain in my chest." And she had to change doctors. But my mother had heart failure. And if it could have been treated then, it may not have gone into such a significant health problem that contributed to her passing in later years. So with racial disparity, it has happened since the dawn of man, since Blacks were brought over here on slave ships. And what we need to do is to acknowledge it. One of the things that they were talking about during the pandemic, yes, people of color were dying at higher rates. And they were saying obesity and hypertension. It was almost like blaming the victim, that we were not taking care of our health. So when this other illness came upon us, we were not in a physical condition to fight it. But according to data, those whites, the majority of whites who died from COVID-19 to date were in nursing homes. The majority of people of color who died were of working age. And for many of them, they were considered essential workers. And we're not talking about doctors and nurses per se. We were talking about bus drivers, train conductors, FedEx drivers. So they were greater exposed to the virus simply because they were trying to generate income to support themselves and their family. So with racial disparity, it is a step moving forward. But right now, I think the majority of attention is on racial justice. And we have to make sure that that racial justice, as it applies to law, also needs to apply to the whole picture of health, economics, of how we are living in this country that has put us in this place right now.
Sorry, Jen, I cannot go to the next question without commenting on Jasmine's story. And I think it's a godsend story of two individuals with the same family name encountering a situation like this. And thank God there was a camera to show how the difference between being a man of color and a white woman that is illegally unleashing her dog, where I have been screamed at, taking my dog to the ramble and not knowing, and I've been screamed at by bird watchers, and I was like so sorry for the next, 10 minutes, and seeing her attitude, which was not even an attitude of someone who was scared, it was an attitude of someone who was taught to use her white privilege against a man of color. So thank God for those videos, and thank God that we can watch those things now, that they can go viral. And I have hope. I have hope. I think it's a time of change all over the world with what happened with COVID, and a time of change where just the way we're talking about it, when we used to talk about anti-racist movements, and now we're like really dividing. There is a problem in the psychology of people that needs to be fixed. And then there is a problem at many, many levels of the systems that need to be fixed. And I am so sorry for all those years where it was ignored, where laws seemed to be equal, and people of color had to live with it, living like through the victims of all those unlayered inequalities. But I really think that this is a time of change. And so, Jasmine, let's talk about the work you're doing with your firm today to raise consciousness, provide safe spaces for employees to engage, and create concrete opportunities for equity.
Right. So, as mentioned, I think that everything lined up, this is just kind of a general life strategy I have. I think things play out the way that they're intended to. Would we have these protests if we were in COVID? If. Even the situation with Amy and my uncle, if we weren't in quarantine, would Amy have walked her dog at that time? Would my uncle be out bird watching at that time? I don't know. I do think, though, that the impact of COVID-19 on populations, disproportionate impact on populations that are already under a tremendous amount of stress, helped, and help is a funny word, but it helped support the inequities, the racial inequities, the economic inequities, the social inequities that are coming up in conversation now. We're talking now about how school districts come together. That's something that came out also during COVID, right? We have students that only eat when they're at school, that only eat if they have meals provided for them by the state. Those conversations were happening in COVID, and now we're talking about, well, how are these school districts even happening in the first place? How are things being drawn the way that they're drawn? Why is it that kids don't have access to fresh food, fresh groceries? Why are they living in food deserts? So I think the COVID conversation, or I guess more so, the stage of COVID built is really the foundation for what's going on right now. And when we look at a lot of companies and corporations and employers responding to what's currently going on, we're seeing lots of kind of general support condemning racism. I think we can all agree racism, it's time to go. But we're also seeing companies do two things. First, dedicate resources to the cause of equity, whether it's financial resources or whether it is the business that they're in. I work for a law firm, and so our talents are within the legal profession. Our connections are within the legal profession. Our connections are with people who are policymakers and influencers. That forms some of the work that our employer is doing. We can look into pro bono work. We can look into civil rights work. I think each employer has a unique opportunity to not only put money towards the cause, but your talents towards the cause. Another thing we're seeing a lot of companies do is take a look at their own internal systems and how equitable they are. We're looking at things like salary surveys. We're looking at things like, what is the exact word? I apologize, but it's a job distribution report that essentially lists the title of each job within a workplace and how many people have those jobs. How many C-suite folks do you have? How many senior managers do you have? How many managers do you have? How many administrative assistants do you have? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then run it by race, run it by gender, run it by, pull it apart by all these different demographics. And then you can really see how equitable your own workplace is. Taking a look at hiring practices. Are they equitable? Do you have diverse candidate pools? If you outsource it, do you work with companies, or is it in your contract that they have to have a diverse candidate pool? I know at my job, our promotions run somewhat in a class. We all get promoted at the same time of year across the company. Look at that promotion class. Is it male heavy? Is it women heavy? Is it white heavy? Is it, these are the type of things that companies can start doing to really evaluate where they are internally in terms of providing equity for Black and brown people and for women.
But the thing, and I applaud your company, Jasmine. It sounds wonderful. And I'm sure that you're very proud to be representing them. But one of the things I want to say is that you can't climb the ladder if you can't get through the door. And with HR, they need to be specifically trained to their own implicit bias. And according to NBER, that if you have a Black sounding name like Rashida or Dwayne, you have to send out 15 resumes before you get a response back. If you have a white sounding name like Jennifer or Christopher, you send out 10 resumes and you get a response back. So for those who have the Black sounding names, they have to send out approximately 33% more resumes before they can even be equal. And then you look at the disparities with women who we earn less than men. And then when you look at that category, when you break it down, Black women, Hispanic women, and Native American women all earn less than white women who are earning less than white men. So we have to look at these things and be aware of them. And, one other thing that I wanted to discuss with HR with their own implicit bias is to do something that's called resume masking and removing all identifying characteristics. Like if your name is, again, Marcus, and, if you were a member of the African American Professionals of DC, to remove all of that and just to look at the skills and abilities and bring that person in. Because there is definitely a prejudice against women overall. And it was according to a college, I don't remember the name of it, that there is a preference over women to have men brought in if they see a male name. So we need to get to the granular level. So when those class promotions happen, there are actually people in the class that can fill and add to that company, their diversity of thought, their diversity of opinion, and enrich the company with their backgrounds.
And I'm wondering during this period of time when we're remote working and even when we go back to work, that the future of the office is going to look very different than what it did in the past. And so now that many companies are actually interviewing online, doing web and Skype interviewing, with the increasing utilization and reliance on technologies, I'm wondering if machine learning and AI platforms will be able to better advance and provide further assistance in this space, Jennifer, to exactly your point. And is that an opportunity for entrepreneurs that can provide some solutions?
I think it is an opportunity, but I have seen some recent conversations within the last year that the AI systems can be biased because of who wrote the code. Because of it's not AI does not live on its own. We as people, as developers, as engineers, tell it what to do and it does its thing. And so to Jennifer's point, we have to make sure that when we are using these systems, whether it is AI or human, that there's review, that there is a review for implicit bias, there's training on implicit bias. I've seen programs that run a resume for you, and some of them will make mistakes and flag things based on, again, it follows a set of rules and codes that are coded in, and it does what it's supposed to do. So we have to make sure that when we build these type of platforms, that we're doing it from an equitable space. I think it's an incredible opportunity to use technology, but we have to make sure that we're using it appropriately.
It's a very good point, Jasmine. Technology is really just the sum of human beings, after all, at the end of the day.
Exactly. A friend of mine, she brought this up. It was a few years ago, so I don't remember who exactly it was. And it's actually, very horrifying, where she typed into the browser, she wanted a picture of a Black person, and what came up was a gorilla. So, and she said, oh, okay. And she did it again and again and again and again, a gorilla came up. And so we can only go so far. Technology does not have life. It's the people who are programming it. And so you can't blame technology if the person behind it is flawed.
Totally. Jennifer, is there anything you want to say on the role of HR in addressing implicit bias from recruiting, hiring, retention, and promotion? Or do you feel like we covered it all?
Well, well, what I would say is, earlier about the resume masking, about giving everyone a fair share. And, this is more of Jasmine's area with diversity and inclusion. You can't have diversity without inclusion. And you can be as diverse as you want, but if you don't make the person feel welcome, that they are valued, that they are contributing, they will leave. And a friend of mine once said that diversity is akin to being asked to the party, and inclusion is akin to being asked to dance. So you can say, I'm diverse till Sunday, but if you don't keep those people, they will leave. And on the flip side, for those who are white, they have to understand that these people are not being brought in just to check off a box. We have a Native American, we have a Black person, okay, because there will be resentment about it. And so everyone needs to be educated as to why diversity and inclusion is critical, and bringing out some proof points, such as organizations have higher retention, they make more money, all the positives. And so that is something I feel that HR should also understand, that they need to educate those who are not Black or Latino or whatever, so that everybody comes to the same place with a greater understanding, so there's no misunderstanding down the road.
Jennifer, many conversations are simply about the desire to do the right thing, but not knowing when or how. Do we or don't we say something? How does this impact how a corporation firm thinks through inclusion efforts now? Can you tell us a little bit about the uncomfort of communicating through the situation for the past 3 weeks? That is, we think here that any communication is better than no communication, and definitely knowing how to communicate the proper way. And I think you lay down the ground very well by talking about the differentiation between unconscious bias, racism, and how to change things at work. How can we change them in society? How can people individually start making that change as a personal reflection?
I think one of the first things you can do is to identify your own implicit bias. And there is a test that you can take, and it's given by Harvard, and it's the Implicit Association Test. And you can go online, and there are several different categories. It's gender, it's sexuality, it's color. It's totally anonymous, and you go on and you take the test, and you select which one you want. And then at the end of it, it will say, you are biased in this, or you're not biased. So understanding where your bias is absolutely critical. And then the other thing is, ask yourself these questions. Look around you. How many of your friends look like you? Okay. How many of your friends have the same religion as you? Where you live, is it everybody like you there? Does everybody have gone to college or have advanced degrees? Take a look at your own life. And I call this individuation. Take a look at yourself and look at others, because everyone here on this panel has been a victim of unconscious bias. So let us not write other people's stories before they even open their mouth. Let them write their own stories. And to expand your world, I did a TED Talk on implicit bias in December, and it was up in Albany, and the audience was primarily white. And I said to them, how many people are going to go to a Kwanzaa event? And nobody raised their hand. And I said, you can go. It's not like you're going to go to a Black church and you're going to be slapped and thrown out because you're not Black. It's like, you'll be welcomed. It's fine. go and see, take a step outside of your normal routine. And one of the blessings of being in New York City is that we have so many places that we can go to, whether it's Chinatown in Manhattan or Little Italy in the Bronx, that we can go to and explore. And just to open up our minds, one last thing is to read. And if you feel more comfortable doing that, absolutely. Some of the books that I've seen, White Fragility is one of them. Roxane Gay, who's a new columnist for the New York Times, she's been whipping out some really good columns of late. So, just take a step back and see who you are. Don't beat yourself up, but you definitely can take small steps to make yourself more understanding of the world around you. One of the great things that Mayor Dinkins would say, and I'll wind it up here, he's a former mayor of New York, and in his inaugural statement, he said, New York is a glorious mosaic. And that's what I'm going to wind down with, that we are living in a country that's a glorious mosaic. I'm first generation American. My parents loved this country. And it is because we all came from someplace else and formed this nation of ours. So all we have to do is step outside the door and enjoy what we have in front of us.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's so beautifully stated. It's interesting when we think about, the resources that are available to us now to help us understand implicit bias. I think Peggy McIntosh, who's a scholar at Wellesley College, does a really good job with helping frame the body of work that's known as whiteness theory. And she actually has a checklist that you can go through as well. It's many, many years old. I used it to teach probably 2 decades ago now. But it's a really interesting checklist that really helps people come to terms with understanding how their white privilege impacts race relations on a daily basis. Jasmine, I want to go to something you said when you and I were talking earlier that I think it really boils it down to, because we're talking about really complicated issues around everything that touches our society economically, politically, culturally, and socially. But you said something that really narrowed it down and really simplified it and really helped to peel back the layers. You said that, do we value money or do we value life? It's very clear, right? And watching the show today, we have a mix of female and male business owners, corporate executives, entrepreneurs. Talk to us about what that means to you. Do we value money or do we value life?
Right. So I think when we were discussing, it was actually around the current situations with the protest. And you and I talked, today is Tuesday, so you and I must have talked last week. And it's kind of crazy how much things have changed in a week, how much the protests even have changed within a week. And what we were discussing was essentially, and this was still when there was some property destruction, vandalism, and theft happening within the protests that were being called riots. We discussed how in American society, Western society, we, as a consensus, every time value things over human life. And that now that we're seeing things being destroyed in the protest, whenever we focus on the destruction, again, we're focusing on the things that are being destroyed and not human life. The purpose of the protest was about human life. When I was talking to my firm and drawing some examples that kind of made people say, oh, okay, that's right. I was in Philadelphia in 2008 when the Phillies won the World Series. I am not a sports fan. But the fans in Philadelphia are, some people say, the best fans in the world or the worst fans in the world. And after a big sports celebration, and we're not talking about the team sanctioned victory parade, but oftentimes you'll have these spontaneous celebrations, whether it's a victory or a defeat. And you'll see bonfires, you'll see property destruction, you'll see a lot of different things going on. But we as Americans don't view it as a protest. We don't view it as a riot. We view it as normal. We have normalized having a physical response to an emotion as long as that emotion is sport. So now when we have protests and different things are happening within the protest, are we saying that having a physical reaction to an emotion, and that emotion being anger over loss of life and systematic racism, it's not appropriate to respond that way? But it's appropriate to respond that way about sports. So the room got quiet when I said that. Then I said, I am old enough to remember about a month ago, 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, there being protests where people were armed to the teeth, storming state houses here in America, state houses of Democratic governors primarily, demanding that stay-at-home orders be lifted. And these protesters coughed on police officers, and again, armed to the teeth. And it was covered. It was covered as a protest. What were they protesting? Well, they're losing access to goods and services. Again, stuff. You're losing access to either making a living, right? Income, money, or you're losing access to being able to do what you would like to do in terms of services, getting your hair cut, going to yoga, having brunch, things like that. And that was covered as protest. Yet what was happening a week ago was covered as riots. I'm not aware of anyone within the protests that have been happening, that have been having openly carrying firearms, multiple firearms. I'm not aware of anyone coughing on police officers. I'm not aware of any of those things that have happened just 5 weeks ago happening now. But again, as Americans, we were able to rationalize the protest against stay-at-home orders, but we are not able to rationalize what's going on now. It's an inequity. It's an equity we've been taught. It's an inequity that, as pieces of the American fabric, that it's in us. It's in us. And we have those uncomfortable moments that we have to sit back and say, yeah, you're right. That is inequitable. You're right. Why do we do this and we don't do that? Why is it okay that this happens this way and it doesn't happen that way? I think Jennifer was talking about, how we can all make changes in our life and to improve the current situation. Systematic racism is a huge, 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 huge topic, and it can feel very overwhelming, and it can feel like, well, where do I start? Where do I sink my teeth into it? I may not be a D&I professional. I may not be an HR. I may not run my own business. So what is it that I can do? And I encourage people to focus on their spheres of influence. If you have Black friends, how are you engaging with your Black friends? If you don't have any Black friends, okay, pause on that, because Black people are wonderful and you should have Black friends. But what are you doing with your Black colleagues? Do you share their work on LinkedIn? Do you publicly praise them? Do you promote what they're doing in meetings and in front of management? If you don't have any Black colleagues, again, why not? But do you have any Black industry peers? Are you sharing their work on LinkedIn? Are you inviting them to industry events? If you don't have any Black industry peers, again, you have to take inventory of what's happening in your life. It may make you uncomfortable, but you can grow from that uncomfortable space. So if you don't have any Black friends, you don't have any Black peers, if the only Black people that are in your life are those that are service providers, right? Whether it's your administrative assistant, whether it's the person that works on your car, whether it's your stylist, whatever it would be, what do you know about these people? What conversations do you have with them outside of small talk while you're being serviced? If the only Black and brown people in your life are service providers, are you ensuring that they're being paid fairly? Do you even know what it means to be paid fairly? These are questions that, I get it, as an adult, it can be really, really tough to make new friends, right? I've had the same friends for ever. When you kind of occasionally will have a colleague cross over into friendship, and it can kind of be a weird space. So I get it being difficult to step out of your door and say, hey, I want to be friends with Black people now, but you can examine every layer of your life and see how you can better connect and how you can use, again, your talents, your privilege to better advance Black and Brown people and women.
That's so important, Jasmine. And I think there's also, I mean, a large part of what you're talking about is the work that each of us needs to do individually to really do that self-assessment, do the self-audit. In many of the same ways that companies are performing their audits right now along the unconscious bias, implicit bias lines, like for each of us to really take heart at understanding, what's resonating within us, and then question the world around us, right? And something you said really struck me, because I remember when the pandemic first hit, in many communities outside of Manhattan, but in upstate New York and New Jersey and Long Island, people were standing in lines for hours waiting to buy handguns, waiting to buy weapons. And because the fear was the pandemic's coming, the world's going to end, so I have to protect myself, I have to protect my stuff, to your point, I have to protect my property. I have to protect all the things, all the possessions that I've accumulated. And to see those pictures in the news was horrifying, because they were all white men, honestly, waiting in line. And so if you flip the narrative and change that, like, what would the response optically have been if those were all African-American men standing in line waiting to purchase weapons to protect their possessions and their properties during probably what it will be the worst pandemic of modern history, right? And so it's, I think at Mayshad, we always encourage all of us to think through identity in a very complex way, and using this period of time to keep questioning, keep flipping the narrative to see, okay, so what would the reverse of this look like, right? And use our strength and our voices as leaders. It's, much of what we talked about here is, the work that we do as individuals, but then how do we show up each and every day as leaders? And we're also consumers, we're investors, and we're voters. And keeping all of those in mind as we move, particularly in an election year too, right? To really think through, how do we want to move forward together as a country, and what do we want to use as inspiration in the sense of how we get there, and really, honestly, how we work together to achieve that.
Right. And it doesn't have to be, major things. Someone was saying, I think he just brought up a point about how, what we bring into the workplace and how we show up in the world and things that we do. Another thing to do is, if you're in a book club, are you sharing books from Black authors? For your news, do you consume news from Black journalists? When you travel, do you support Black restaurants and Black-owned businesses? In your own city, do you support Black restaurants and Black-owned businesses? And these are small things that folks may not think about, but they are small adjustments that really help when we're talking about what we want our future to look like. That help. When you support a Black author, a Black restaurant, a Black business, you're putting money back into a community, and you're providing equity to people that 50 years ago may not have been able to have a business, may not have been able to publish books. When we're talking about diversity and inclusion, it's not just at work, it's not just in hiring, it's not just in HR, it's in our lives. It's what we read, it's what we consume, it's what we eat, it's the music we listen to. The changes that we make don't have to be major overhauls of society. They can be small changes that we make different decisions for.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Jennifer, for leaving us with such inspiring yet pragmatical action plan to each implement on an individual level. We all have a power of influence. When you're giving this example of, if each one of us out there just more consciously supports the African American community, there will be so much give back that is needed to be given. Jan, should we go to our audience questions? I know that they're very good. And thank you again to both of you for accepting the invitation.
I love this part of our shows. Please, everyone out there, please make sure to send us your questions. We have so many right now. Please keep them coming, and we promise to get to as many as we can. The first question is, let me make sure my phone works here. All right, this is a great question because it speaks to the nature of complexity with family members. How should we acknowledge implicit bias when trying to educate family members, friends, coworkers that have developed their own biases? How should we effectively start the conversation, particularly in a moment in time when we're theoretically all living under the same roof together during remote work and COVID-19?
So I think this is a question that first, when we talk about intersectionality, it's important to first know your family. Any strategies that we give you, you know that if it'll work well or if it won't work well in your home. I think that it's important to have, when you're having natural, organic conversation, to ask people to pause for a second, repeat back to them what they just said, and then ask why. A lot of times when you ask people to get really focused on what it is they're saying, they will talk through their own understanding of either what they're saying is wrong or an area that they need to grow. So an example that we've had, as I said, I live here in Washington, D.C. So I'll get a phone call saying, oh, is your city still on fire? Or, are the crazies still running around? It's a really great, simple opportunity to have conversation right there. So no, actually, our city was never on fire. The only time it was really kind of hectic was when the president decided to walk from the White House to a church and told it is still up for debate, either the Secret Service, Park Police, it was not DC police, we do know that, to clear the crowd, to clear the peaceful crowd. So I think having facts is really important when having these conversations. A lot of these conversations with family are based on emotions, are based on assumptions, are based on feelings. And when you try to have the conversation with facts and keep the conversation focused on the facts, I found that to be effective. Another thing is agreeing to disagree. My father and I disagree on the situation in terms of the protest and the people that were looting and doing things like that, and the vandalism and the theft. We're from a different generation. He obviously remembers when Martin Luther King was killed and the riots that came after that. But being a Black man of his age, he has a very different relationship to authority than I do, and has very different opinions about authority than I do. And I teased him and I said, oh, you're afraid of the police. And, for certain people, yeah. For Black people, yes. He remembers when police would put fire hoses on Black people and sick German shepherds on Black people. So, yeah. He doesn't fundamentally understand how people are outside looting and breaking the law. But having conversations with him about, well, it's not so much about the looting. It's more so about this. And yes, there are people that are being opportunistic and getting their Gucci bags and new sneakers and all of that. But by and large, that's not what this is about. That's not what the protests are about. And that's really not what's really been happening. So again, I would really encourage you to have conversations based on fact. Be prepared to agree, disagree.
Thank you, Jasmine. Jennifer, would you like to add to this?
I feel that when you're in such closed environments, it can be, quite tumultuous to have these conversations. Outside of what is happening. But the fact remains is that this is an event that is happening in real time. And whether you're outside, inside, it's touching your life. So I believe that these conversations are starting organically and that people need to, speak to them in an honest and open way. And if somebody has an opinion that's different from yours, don't attack them for it. As Jasmine was saying, try to get to the root of it and to find out what their thinking is. And, sometimes you just have to go, we agree to disagree, because there are times when you cannot change someone's mind. but at least we can listen to what they're saying and we understand each other. But again, during these times, I think that it is so tumultuous out there that not to talk about it, I think, would be highly unusual. These conversations are being had and they are difficult, but you need to have them.
Thank you. I really appreciate what you both said too, because a large part of this is really about listening, right? And even though we may have to agree to disagree from time to time, but really truthfully listening to really figure out, what their perspective is and where they're coming from. And it helps us understand their own socialization processes, I think, in a different way too. We have time for one more question. How should we deal with implicit bias during any discourse when we're trying to create a safe space for elevated and meaningful conversations that can generate true transformation?
When I do my presentations, I always start off with, this is a safe space. You will not be judged. And I want people to know, and I say this, is that you will not learn unless you are honest. And we cannot put ourselves into another person's shoes. So the only way that you can have this discussion is to have it to be open, but you must feel comfortable enough that your words will not be held against you. And so I feel that saying first and foremost that it's a safe space, to adhere to it and to make sure that the person is comfortable, that will open up the doors so wide that you will get so many comments. And I've seen this in my presentations. And on my end as a trainer, there was this one person, she said something, two family members of mine are white. And she goes, how did you get related to them? And so my immediate reaction was, I said, by blood, how else do you get related to it? But you know what? It just showed her that families can be multiracial. And apparently she just did not even consider that in the moment.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Jennifer. We are over time, so it'd be great to continue this conversation and do a 2.0 conversation with both of you as well. Neza, what do you think?
Yes, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you, everyone. And you can find us next Tuesday for our diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation. You can find us on YouTube and find this episode that will be aired for you to share, and join us anytime at joinmayshad.com.